Well, welcome back, everyone, to SuiteScript Stories, hosted by Salto. My name is Eric Grubaugh, and I am joined by my intrepid co-host, Tim Dietrich.
Intrepid? That's a good one.
You're going to get a new adjective every month. We'll see what it is.
Elusive.
Today,
next time.
Today we are here to talk about technical debt. What is it? Managing it, how to pay it down, all that sort of stuff. Before we do that, this episode is hosted and sponsored by Salto. Salto is not a consulting firm trying to sell you services. They have built a DevOps platform for SuiteScript developers for managing and tracking and deploying your changes to NetSuite. So if you'd like to learn more about that, check out salto.io. And now, Tim, this was your topic. So I'm going to make you talk about it the whole time.
So that means I have to go first.
It does mean you have to go first. Okay. Before we get into like what sort of inspired it or why it's top of mind, we should probably talk about what it is. So I want to hear your definition of technical debt.
Okay. I guess before I get into that part of it, I think this is going to be an interesting conversation and challenging because I think technical debt is one of those things that nearly every developer, whether you're a SuiteScript developer or not, you've probably run into it and experienced it. You might even have created some of this technical debt yourself, whether knowing it or not, right? Not you,
Never.
Though, right? And my guess is, though, that if you were to ask a developer what it is, they would struggle to explain it and describe it, right? Like, as I was doing research for this, trying to prepare, I thought the phrase, I don't know how to tell you what it is or how to describe it, but I know it when I see it.
You know, when you see it.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? And I also got to thinking that I wish that we could share some code samples, but that's difficult, right? We have to protect the guilty in this case, which may be you and me. I don't know.
Would probably be me.
Definitely, like I could find my own for sure. But then the other part of that is that you and I could both be looking at the same, body of code. I might look at it and think it's horrible and it is technical debt. You might not think that, right? Like, I think it's also, there's like it's subjective, right?
Yes.
To some extent. So like, going back to what you asked, what is it? The best that I can say is like, it's a metaphor, right? And it's actually, I went back to try to figure out who it was that came up with this originally, and it was Ward Cunningham. I'll try to put links, or we'll put links in the show notes to some of the stuff, but that's who it's attributed to, which I thought was interesting. And then a really good definition of it I found on Wikipedia, which is, I'll try to read this. In software development or any other IT field, like infrastructure, networking, et cetera, technical debt, also known as design debt or code debt, is the implied cost of future reworking required when choosing an easy but limited solution instead of a better approach that could take more time. So my summarized version of that is, it's basically when you're developing something, you're in a hurry, and you start cutting corners, right? And you have that sort of, or I do anyway, that sort of thing in your gut where you're like, I'm going to regret this later. That's my best way of describing what technical debt is. I'm curious to see how you would define it.
That feeling when you start apologizing to future you. I'm so sorry, me, for 6 months from now.
Or the next guy who inherits your code, right? The next developer that comes along, and
of course, the next person, yeah.
You wonder why your ears are ringing sometimes, and maybe it's like some developers just stumbled upon your technical
shaking
debt.
Their fist and shouting your name.
Yeah, exactly. So
my definition is probably similar. I wrote it here. I'll read it. It's a compromise that you make in design or development that down the road may or may not cause you problems or increase the maintenance efforts of that code or that system or whatever it happens to be. It is not necessarily a bug. It's not necessarily even a problem with the system in its current state or the functionality it provides. It's not always bad. And I have more about that maybe later. I think the thing that's interesting from like either your definition, well, and even mine, is that you don't always know that you're incurring technical debt. You don't always see it happening as you're typing it, because you never have all the information up front. You don't ever know how your system will be used. No plan, no design survives contact with reality, ever. You don't know all the things. You don't know what you don't know. So you don't know what's going to need updated or changing in the future. You just sort of develop best guesses as you get more experienced. So you can't, because of that, you can't completely avoid it. There's no way to avoid all the technical debt. You just can't, because you don't have all the information.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think as I started to think more about this and research it, there were things that I discovered that I hadn't really thought about before. And for some reason, I was always under the impression that technical debt was always bad. And I've got a list of, some misconceptions about technical debt, and that is one of them, right? Sometimes it makes sense to like take it on, especially when you are, maybe working on a proof of concept, and you just need it to work. But I bet I'm not alone in this, in that like sometimes you develop a proof of concept and that's what ends up going live, and that's a scary thing, right? Like,
Yep.
because you as
Or
a developer are like, are we sure we want to do this? And managers or customers are like, let's do it. And underneath, there's this like,
why not? This works.
Yeah, right. And that's the other thing, right? It's not, like you said, it's not always code that is buggy. It's not always technically incorrect, right? It could work forever. Maybe you can get away with it, right? And that's something else I've read that, the developers say, I know I've got all this technical debt, but I've been lucky. I haven't had to deal with it, right? But yeah, I don't know.
The skeleton's in the closet.
Yeah, you just don't know when the door's going to open and that skeleton's going to come out, right? It's going to get you. It's going to burn you at some point. You mentioned too in your definition that one of the problems with it is that it can eventually potentially making changes or enhancing code more difficult, but it also goes further than that. It can make even estimating the effort that goes into those changes that have been requested more difficult. I mean, how often have you opened up code that maybe was yours, maybe it wasn't? Seems like a pretty easy request, change to the code, but then you start looking at it and you're like, oh no, like in order to make this simple change, I've got to right, there's this module or this body of work in there, functions that, are going to require reworking because assumptions were made, maybe corners were cut, whatever, but there's that technical debt getting you right there, right? So it's like the bill collectors come along. Now it's time to pay, and sometimes with interest, right? Like to continue that analogy of the debt. So
sometimes you've even seen the bill before, and other times you have not.
Right. Yeah, and like I said, sometimes you get away with it. Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
You probably have plenty of technical debt throughout your career that's literally never come up. It's never had any impact on the system it's in. Users have never noticed or anything like that. That's probably the majority of technical debt. It's stuff that just doesn't come up. It's stuff that never impacts the system at all. And you might look at the code later and think like, well, this isn't ideal, or, in a perfect world or in a classroom setting, I wouldn't write it this way or teach it this way, but it works and it works fine. It's stable. And that can be good enough. I'm skipping around like in our topics and my notes a little bit, but like you don't always have to pay down all your technical debt. You're always going to have to make trade-offs, just like you do with the design that created the technical debt. You're going to have to make trade-offs in prioritization and with product work or system work or new features, bug fixes, all that stuff. And technical debt often just gets pushed to the bottom. It's the hardest to sell, if you will. But that's really okay. You can have a backlog of technical debt that just never rears its head or does, and it's not, it's just not a significant enough impact to warrant the work it would take to fix it.
Yeah, like I mentioned, I have a bunch of misconceptions that I was going to talk about, and one of them was that refactoring, like the misconception is that refactoring is always the way to pay down the debt, right? Well, I'll just rewrite that code. That's not necessarily true that refactoring always works, right? As a matter of fact, you can sometimes actually make things worse. And I would imagine you've run into this one too. I don't know, maybe not, but sometimes I'll go back and see something that I wrote and I'll, like look at it and I'll think, did I really write that? Like, what was I thinking? I'll rewrite it now. And then I start rewriting it. And I think I'm like, making the code better, whatever that means, right? Air quotes around better. And then, I get deep into it and I'm like, oh, now I remember why I did it this way, right? Is it technical debt at that point? Like you've tried to pay it down, like, I don't know. So anyway, I guess my point being there that refactoring isn't always the solution. Sometimes you just need, I guess what I'm getting at maybe is sometimes maybe there's no way to pay it down. Like, I don't know, maybe you need a fresh set of eyes or somebody else come along and clean the mess up, or at least get a second opinion, right? So
yeah, and
so
here's the
there's
thing
that.
about refactoring and technical debt. The refactor will have its own technical debt. It will bring in new technical debt because you won't have all the information. Again, you will never have it all, no matter what. Your refactor might fix all the existing problems. It might fix all of them. It probably won't, but it might. But it will incur its own technical debt, and you'll be right back here again. It's a cycle. It's endless. It's permanent. And so the focus can't be on how do we avoid it, because you don't. But you can mitigate it, and you can have strategies for paying it down. So I'm curious how you think about that when you see something, whether it's yours or not, like, oh, this, when you identify something and you have assuming the priority is there and all that good stuff, when you're ready to work on technical debt, how do you think about it?
I guess before I answer that one, I want to go back to like, well, what are some of the
Feel free to
causes
back me up.
and the reasons for it, right? Like what, in other words, how does it come to be anyway? And I have a whole bunch of potential ways that we end up like feeling like we should take that technical debt on, right? So part of it, I think you alluded to this, is you don't know everything about the problem you're trying to solve, right? You're limited in what you know. Sometimes you don't understand the scope that's laid out in front of you right from the beginning. Other times scope creep comes along and that code that you wrote to like deal with what the original scope was suddenly doesn't really fit the bill anymore, right? Because the scope, the goal has changed. I think you're more likely to run into technical debt when you're hurrying, when you're being rushed. And I know this is a sore spot for you too, but when there's unrealistic deadlines, right? The we needed it yesterday problem where, you're not only in a rush to write the code, but you also now have to create a time machine and go back in time to meet yesterday's goal. I could go on and on. Interruptions, I think, cause it too, right? We're writing our code or get bombarded with instant messages, emails, whatever. There's inexperience, right? If you're not an experienced developer, or maybe you don't understand the business that you're dealing with or writing that code for, I think that can cause problems sometimes. And I'm sure none of us have done this, but the whole copy pasting approach to software development, where I found this good snippet online of code and, I just copied it into my SuiteScript and, I don't really understand what it does, but it seems like it's working and oh, good. And then similarly, I think for like larger bodies of code, libraries that we don't understand, you don't have to understand everything, I guess. And that's a tricky topic, the whole, like, should I depend on these external libraries? But I think you should stop and like question, what's the reputation of the code of the developer? You're like, can I trust that this code really does what it says it's going to do? If
Sure.
you don't understand it, you're taking a leap of faith. So all those things I just sort of rattled off, I think, are ways that we end up taking on technical debt, whether we realize it or not. Does any of that
Move
resonate
fast
with
and break
you?
stuff.
Yeah, that's not me. I don't, I don't do well in that circumstance, right? And so getting back to your question, like as a developer, like what can I do about it? How can I avoid it? I think there's, again, like a long list of things that you could do here. Some of them are just common sense. I think following best practices, best practices exist for a reason. That being said, sometimes you got to break the rules, right? So I'll go both ways on that, but it can't hurt to try.
Classic consultant answer right there.
Yeah, right.
Why not do both?
Yeah, we could see if my way works, and if it doesn't, then we'll go back to the best practice. I found this quote to be really interesting too. And when you're tempted to take on technical debt, meaning you just want to get it done, right? There's a quote from Hunter S. Thompson that says, anything worth doing is worth doing right. So I would try to remember that when, that temptation is there where you're like, I wonder if I could get away with this. It's not the right way to do it, maybe. So should you try to get away with it? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, in general, I agree. And in a sort of ideal, isolated, again, classroom or laboratory setting, you're right. You should do the right thing, do it the right way. But in the real world, you are often constrained by many things out of your control: the budget, the timeline, the client, the whatever.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of variables and pressures outside of your control that oftentimes you don't get to make that decision. You don't get to prioritize that. You don't get to choose to do it the right way. You have no choice. You have to do it the fast way, the wrong way, or the good enough way. I'm not trying to suggest any unethical things here, but sometimes you just have to do it, or you're billing by the hour and the meter's running. So you can't just spend infinite time billing away, thinking and building the perfect system. You need to build something that's good enough to fit the project requirements and timeline and all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing you can do when you're running into that situation is ask yourself if you think you're going to regret the decision to sort of cut that corner, right? And the answer is almost always yeah, but
Standard part of your code review process. Will we regret this later?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was gonna say. The next thing too is, ask people you work with, ask your manager, look, I can do it this way. It's not the right way to do it, but it'll probably work, could probably get away with it. Is it worth it for me to take the time to do it right? Or are we in such a rush that, you want me to go ahead with this, right? In other words, get permission to do the wrong thing.
Yeah.
At least then you could say, well, you told me it was okay. So
trying to spread the
and
blame.
maybe put that in the inline comments, like, hey, this code very questionable, but I got permission to do it. Put the date and time. CYA.
Yeah,
but
there's some of that.
I think that there's also, some practical things that we can do to avoid it. Like I strive to write readable code to the point of like that's my thing, right? So, hopefully it's code that if someone else inherits your code later on, they'll appreciate you taking the time to kind of write that readable code. We could probably have a whole episode on what I'm talking about, readable,
I think we did.
clean. Yeah, we probably did. I don't know.
We could do a part two.
Code that you wouldn't be embarrassed to show, like, you're like, oh God, I hope that no developer ever sees this mess that right? Like that, and then code that you yourself, we talked about this few minutes ago, your future self will appreciate, like, oh God, I'm glad I took the time to do this right, because, you know, right. The other thing is, don't fool yourself into thinking that you'll clean it up later. Like, that's another huge thing. Oh, okay, like, I'll put a to-do in here, come back and
Mhm.
revisit this later. You never do.
Yeah.
So, but
Unless you have a dedicated like process for consistently reviewing the friction log or the to-do tags in your code or whatever it might be. If you don't
yeah,
have a dedicated process for consistently reviewing, discussing, and prioritizing that, yeah, it will never ever happen.
yeah, I think
And
that's
I've
where,
never
like,
met a team who does.
right. But I think that, like, that starts to go towards, well, what can managers of developers do to help with this, right? And I think that building, and I know this, like, yeah, in a perfect world, we'd be able to do this, but somehow having time allocated to clean things up, be proactive about it, I think is good, right? It would be nice to think that that's a thing. But I
It
realize
would be.
too that, yeah, again, in a perfect world. But maybe you
Yeah.
can create that perfect little world within your organization that says, at the very least, I think telling your developers, look, if you're working in somebody's code, you're working in part of the code, and you see something that is a mess, and you think, you could clean it up in a reasonable amount of time, chip away at it, right? Maybe you don't have to pay down the entire debt. I guess it depends on the nature of it, but maybe you can start to clean the code up, and over time, enough of that effort, your code is improving, right? So
Yeah.
I think
A
that's,
lot of
having support from managers, to do that is huge.
absolutely. Or managers or clients or whoever, if you work alone, um, having a support system or people who understand uh, what you even mean when you say technical debt helps tremendously. But there's a few things I want to touch on. I think going way back to what you said about like the CYA stuff a little bit, like get some help, get some other input, that's maybe one of the biggest benefits of working on a team, right? Or if you do work by yourself, getting some sort of community of peers that you can reach out to and talk to, having those other eyes because they have different experiences with you. They've solved similar problems or, in different ways. And they just think differently than you do. So getting that other set of eyes and experience is invaluable for sure. I think certainly the support from managers and or whoever's sort of prioritizing the work. I think the lower down the chain you are in the decision making process, and the more I say, like, I don't know, the more disconnected you are from that, the harder it's going to be to sell going back. Yeah, setting up dedicated time to do that, to at least comb through the backlog, comb through all the to-dos or the triple X's or the fix me's that you put in your code. Trying to get all of that tracked and prioritized and then actually implemented is on top of all of the other stuff you're trying to do, feature work, bug fixes, all that stuff. And that competition will never go away. And it's always going to be the hardest to sell, like, well, we kind of didn't build it the right way the first time, and we want to build it the right way now. That's a hard conversation to have, especially if you work for a contracting or a consulting firm who's billing by the hour. If you go back to a client and say, well, we kind of want to redo what we did because we didn't do it quite right, they're not going to be happy.
Yeah.
You wouldn't pitch it that way, of course, but it's always going to be a hard battle to prioritize the technical debt stuff. Even if you work in a team who's like an end user and you're just in a fixed team working on a fixed system, you're still going to have competition with bugs and features that you've got to overcome as well.
Yeah.
If you have a team and a manager who says, yeah, you can spend 10% of your time or 20% of your time doing technical debt refactor stuff, that's amazing. Never leave.
Yeah. I think the challenge there is that technical debt, it's hard to give it priority over things like, you know, like you said, bug fixes, new feature requests, and so on, especially when, again, like we said earlier, especially when that technical debt isn't necessarily, you know, code that isn't working. Maybe it's perfectly fine and it's working, but it's
Yeah.
just a mess, right? Maybe it actually
Or
is
it's a
causing
pain to
problems you don't
change.
know about. Yeah. Maybe it's a performance problem, right? It's working, but it's slow. And so, you
Mhm.
know, I mean, how often do we hear that from end users where they'll say, yeah, this, whatever it is just slow, and it's always been that way. And you look at it and you're like, oh, no, you know, you know, you see the saved search that's from hell, right? You're like, where did this
Yeah.
come from, right? And for
A
me, of
query with
course,
12 joins.
well, you know, sometimes that's okay. But it's always tempting to me when I'm looking at saved searches and I know that that's where it's slow. You know, I'm like, you know, wow, the temptation's there. I could convert that to SuiteQL. And so then the question will pop up from somebody, you know, like, well, is there a utility where you can just take the saved search? And no. So yeah, it's going to take some time to clean that stuff up. But
Mhm.
yeah, I guess my point is that it's hard to get that prioritized, right? So
That's always going to be a battle.
mhm.
Yeah, and I want to touch too on, you mentioned some sort of tools, maybe not tools, but things we can do. And I think the biggest one for me, the best tools that you have as a NetSuite developer for mitigating this is your ability to break down a problem. Way too often, I see code, you see a user event script, and you're customizing the before submit, and all of the code is right there in that before submit function. All of it. It's thousands of lines. You haven't. It's completely a procedural code. The before submit event fires, and you can read literally everything that happens. You haven't broken down that problem at all. So you haven't created any separation of duties. You haven't decoupled anything at all. It's all tightly coupled to that specific event trigger. So the biggest tools you have for breaking down a problem, obviously your brain, but are modules and functions. So the more boundaries and decoupling you introduce, more separation between sort of that event trigger and then the actual logic, the easier it gets to start swapping stuff out or fixing individual parts. In order to do that, you can't just think linearly about this event fires, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. You need that first. You need to understand the full process, and then you need to start breaking that down into components that you can decouple and extract into functions, into modules that you can reorganize. Or if you're introducing a third-party library, like you mentioned, that maybe you don't fully understand, if you put that third-party library and call it directly from the user event script or whatever it is, you haven't decoupled it at all. You've limited your ability to isolate and swap out that third-party library or whatever component it might be. The more layers of separation and concerns that you introduce, the easier it gets to sort of decouple and swap things out and refactor. So if you're just writing procedural code, thousands of lines, you're indenting 12 times, you're going to run into this a lot. It's going to get harder and harder to address your technical debt when you actually want to. So
Yeah.
that's the best tool you have, is to stop writing procedural code and start breaking down problems into modules and functions. And then by extension of that, you get a little bit more of your readable code because you're giving modules names, you're giving those functions names that are like presumably human readable and aren't just big blocks of record.set values. You can start to make that code more concise and readable in the entry point, so you get a better idea of what the entry point is doing without having to look through thousands of lines of code. And it becomes more testable as well, which is another huge tool for not really mitigating, but for paying it down, is automated testing. but I'll pause for a second before I get into that.
Yeah, a lot of what you said there are things I had made notes to talk about too. So getting back to like, the issue of essentially like writing higher quality code, right? That just comes with experience, hopefully. I think the higher the quality of your code, in theory, the less likely it's going to have technical debt or incur it, right? So going back to like what a manager can do, I think, always encouraging your developers, to just continue to improve, give them training, help them get better at what they do and give them the resources to do it. You and I have talked about that in the past, that's a huge thing. So I think that helps. Testing, absolutely. That's a huge thing. I started to laugh when you mentioned the indented code, 12 tabs indented or whatever, right? And I laughed because I recently looked at a body of code where I'm not a Python developer, but I think white space is a thing there, right? Like, I remember looking at it, I'm like,
Yes.
okay, like a tab actually has meaning. With what we do,
Syntactical meaning, yes.
white space is free. Don't be afraid to tab and put returns. The code I recently had to mess around with was just, it looked like a wall of text, right? It looked like somebody had pasted it into one of these online forms and it stripped all the formatting out, except that's not what they had done. That was literally what they did. So it was, I don't know, whatever. So that was, I guess, more of an aside than anything else, but getting back to the testing, which is, I think, what you were going to talk about, like that, I think that is also huge, right? Like if the tests fail, you've probably got more than technical debt that you're dealing with, but that's sure one way to find out. So.
And I want to touch on Jacob Turnius here has a question about tools for documentation. Documentation is another tool, mitigation strategy you have for technical debt. If you're writing readable code, quote unquote, and you as a team or as a developer, you set the standards for what's readable, but documentation of why you did things a certain way is critical, because your code, your function names and parameter names and et cetera are never going to tell you why you did something a certain way. That's maybe the most important thing to document that. And then sort of at the higher level, the relationship of this script has these components that interact in this way and do and accomplish this business goal. That level of documentation. So Jacob is asking what tools we use. I use JSDoc in my code to document all my functions and modules and that stuff. And then you can use the command line interpreter to actually generate HTML pages of your documentation. So if you're focused on putting you can put the data types of what your parameters are and what they return and all that good stuff. But if you're documenting why a function exists and does the things that it does in that, then you can generate and maintain and host these HTML files wherever you want. And it lives in your code. So it's not in some separate system somewhere that you have to remember to go back to and dig through and find. It's in your code. But no matter what you use, documentation is just as important, deserves just as much attention as the code, or it just like your code, it will get out of date, it will get stale, and it won't work anymore.
I think, we can't stress enough documentation in general, inline comments where it makes sense. I tend to go overboard on that because that's just how I write code and always have. The other thing that you had mentioned earlier that I started to laugh about wasn't, the way that you name things like functions, variables and stuff like that. And we have had on our list of potential episodes, I think gone back to when we very first started doing the podcast, an episode named, a theoretical episode named Naming Things is Hard. I think that's how you summarized it when I told you what I was thinking. Yep. And I think that we really should do that at some point. It's probably, it's another one of those things where opinions are going to differ on how to name things and the length of the names and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
But it's a thing, right? It's hard. And so the other thing that I meant to say before is be consistent in your code, even if you are horrible. You be consistently horrible at maybe at naming things, I don't know, but there's nothing worse than like going through code and seeing that all of a sudden something that had been done a certain way up to that point is now suddenly thrown out the window. And sometimes that's because another developer's got their hands in there, right? It's coming in behind them. But I mean, that's another thing. It makes code difficult to debug, hard to read. So
Mhm.
be consistent, I guess, another thing.
Yeah. And that brings up, Roy has a comment here, but it brings up another constraint we haven't really talked about. When you are a NetSuite or any sort of third-party platform developer, you are constrained by the platform and what it allows you to do. If you need to, if you need NetSuite to behave a certain way and it doesn't, you can't do too much about it. You just have to live with it. So you need strategies for dealing with it, or I guess you hope it's not too bad. But that's another level of constraint we have to deal with as NetSuite developers. Working inside the governance limits, being a good tenant of a shared NetSuite server. You can't just run wild and take over the database. It's just yet another constraint variable you need to consider when you're designing your systems, and more opportunity to develop patterns for how to mitigate these things, how to solve these platform specific problems as well. It's another source of technical debt that maybe a Node backend developer doesn't have.
So one of the other misconceptions that I had on my list about technical debt, and when I read that quote at the beginning of the episode, they mentioned this, and I hadn't really thought about it, is the misconceptions that technical debt only applies to software development, right? Because that's the world that you and I live in. But I got to thinking about like what that quote said, and it's interesting because it also does apply to things like infrastructure, networking, systems architecture, security, things
Let me
that
tell you about all the
sometimes.
technical debt in my house.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Right. And we don't really think about it that way, right? But it's a problem. It's like a ticking time bomb. So yeah, so I thought that was really interesting too. And I'd be willing to bet that a lot of us have that, whether in our personal lives or in business. And, I'm a software guy, so I try not to think about the other parts of it, but do have a network here at home, right? And so, security is a thing. So anyway, you gotta, I guess my point there too is like, look beyond just software. If you're a manager, especially, there's probably debt everywhere, right? Riddled in all areas of your business. And that's a scary thought. So glad I don't manage a business or people, rather myself somehow, sometimes. So.
Yeah. Should I get to the testing? What's next on your list to talk about? We got about 20-ish minutes here.
Yeah, let's talk about testing.
So I think testing, automated testing, is one of the best. It dramatically increases your confidence when you refactor anything, technical debt related or not. If you are building, as you build, if you're building good, solid, automated unit tests, integration tests, any level of test you can, that's automated, that sort of proves that your system works the way it's supposed to, that gives you this tool that whenever you go change something, whenever you go rewrite a function, or swap out a third-party library, that gives you basically a button you can click to say, does it still work the way I need it to? And it also gives you another layer of documentation of why and how this thing works, what sort of cases we expect to put this function through, what the boundary conditions are, what happens when this parameter is null, what happens, does it return the right data format in all the situations we have? This is not a unit testing episode, but yeah, I think that's one of the most powerful tools you have when refactoring anything. And for the most part, when you're fixing technical debt, it's almost always you're going to have to rewrite something. You may not refactor it like you were talking about in some huge dramatic way, but you're going to change the code, and you need to prove that that code still works. And if you don't have any sort of automated testing, if that's all manual and requires your memory to put that whatever you changed through all of the right use cases, you're going to miss something and accrue more technical debt on top of what you just had. So I use Jest, which is the officially supported unit testing tool. There's a Suite app called Accelero that does like integration level testing. We piloted that a while ago. It's interesting. We don't use it at the moment, but that's another option. And there are tons of unit testing and integration testing type modules out there that I'm sure could be hacked to support NetSuite. But the more sort of automation you have around that of, does this thing still work? Does this function do what it's supposed to do? It gives you a huge boost in confidence and layer of protection when you are refactoring anything.
Yeah, and just to kind of add a little more to the testing too, I think that having someone else do the testing, in addition to you testing your own code, is critical, right? Like having somebody else like come behind you and say, okay, yeah, but did you think about this? Or, so there's that. And then, another sort of like practical, I guess, almost like a feel good thing as far as like trying to make sure that your code is doing what it should do and that it's not more technical debt just piling up. Sometimes for me, it's just taking a break, right? I've been writing code for hours, starting to go a little loopy, get a little nuts, walking away from it and then coming back and looking at it later. Sometimes, I mentioned earlier about like you look at code you wrote a while ago and you think to yourself, what was I thinking? Sometimes all it takes is like, a 15-minute break, come back, sit in front of your code, and then you're like, okay, maybe you should just be done for the day at that point based on what you see. But sometimes just, your second set of eyes is helpful as well. So I think that's huge, right? It's like
patience goes a long way.
Yeah. Take the time
even
to
when
review your own code too, right? That's what I'm saying. Like
review it. And even before you start writing it, even when if you're just, most of your job, especially as you get more and more senior, more and more of your job should be thinking, not writing code.
Mm-hmm.
And you should actually be writing less code. Your code should be more concise and there should be less of it. Because you should spend, I say should, this is all my opinion. You should be spending more time thinking and going through multiple design solutions with other people, if possible. Like you said, get those second pair of eyes. And even when you do come up with the solution, wait until you don't just go straight into writing code and just hammer it out. Right. Wait and give that some time to marinate, as it were. You don't always have that luxury. I know the more junior you are and the more closer you are to like that consulting, billing by the hour, churning and burning model, the harder that's going to be. And I don't know that I have great strategies for that. There's so many things that are out of your control in that situation. You have to have a good team around you that's doing a lot of the things we talked about, that's doing code reviews, that is talking about and having standards and patterns for common situations. But a lot of teams don't do that because when you're billing by the hour, you don't get paid to do that stuff.
Yeah.
And that is one of the toughest challenges to overcome as a NetSuite developer if you're in that sort of climate or environment. And it's really hard, and I don't have anything. I don't have anything. I don't have any epiphanies for you. It's just really hard to do really good, solid work in that model.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely stressful, right? When you're under the gun in terms of like needing to get something done quickly, or, you know, go in and clean up, add this function to this code that maybe you've never seen before. I mean, it's extremely stressful. And again,
Client you've never seen before, never met before, don't know what
right.
they do, and you just came off of 10 minutes ago a project in a completely different industry, in a completely different area of NetSuite. You have that context switching to overcome. It's just extremely challenging. And that's why the turnover rate's so high.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think, like, you know, going back to how managers can help with this, that's something that they should be aware of, right? That working under those kinds of conditions after a while, you know, like constant stress, it's going to get to your developers. And whether it's, you know, it's just, you know, they're starting to lose hope, getting frustrated. I mean, it can result in churn, right? Like you're wondering why your developers are walking out the door. Maybe that's part of it, right? I don't know what the solution is there other than, you know, trying to figure out like why they're leaving, and if, you know, quality of the code that they're having to deal with is still a mess. And I don't envy the manager that has to go, you know, to senior managers and say, look, you know, the solution to all this is for us to take some time and maybe rewrite this thing. I mentioned earlier that that's not always the fix. But
or it's to
sometimes it
bill
is.
75% as many hours or 80% as many hours.
Right.
That's never going to go over well unless
And
you
I
have
think,
an extremely, I don't know the adjective I want to use, supportive senior management.
right. And I think maybe part of that too is educating more people at the different levels of your organization about what technical debt is and what the risks are, right? You know, because
how it affects the bottom line.
Yeah. And how it might cause problems later, or already is, right? You know, why that feature that I asked for last week, why did it take so long? It seemed like it should be pretty easy. You said that it should be. Well, you know, when we went into the code, there was this mess that we had to deal with. And so, you know, maybe there's enough of those events that happen too, that they just over time, you know, senior management or managers up and down the chain are, you know, begin to realize, oh, okay, well, maybe we should do something about that. But it's tough. You know, I said at the beginning of this episode that I thought it was going to be challenging to talk about this, and it's easy to just keep going on and on about it. But, you know, like to your point, there's no guaranteed way to prevent technical debt from happening. It's going to happen. It's going to happen to you at some point, and there's no like single way to get rid of it, you know, but it's a thing, right? It's real. And you know, chances are you've seen it. Like I said at the top of the episode, maybe you've incurred some of it yourself. I know for me, you know, it's a red flag when I see it. You know, it makes me sometimes question, you know, who wrote the code. You know, and like,
And you
I
remember
gotta,
it was you.
well, yeah, there's that, especially when you start, you know, like, well, if I ever see that person in a dark alley and then you realize that person's you, right? It's like the goofy meme with Spider-Man, he's pointing at himself or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's that. But there, I mean, there are some projects I've worked on, you know, clients whose instances are just riddled with technical debt. And, you know, it's a red flag. I mean, I think the phrase is it's not a good look, right? It's the saying goes. I don't know. And I guess, you know, I know we still have about 10 minutes or so, but I would sum it up like this. I think that if you care about the quality of the work that you do, and I've said before, I love what I do. I love writing code in general. But I think if you do care about what you're doing with the work that you're doing, then I think you should care about technical debt. You should try to learn about it and try to identify it and come up with your own opinions on all the things that we've talked about. You know, like what works for you and I might not work for anybody else. I'm a solo developer, so I don't have the luxury of like a team of developers that I can turn to, right, to get a second opinion. So
Right.
but I've got other things I can do. So
We are certainly not the first people to try and tackle this problem. There are lots of experts in the field who've written books about the topic. A very good one is called Refactoring. Maybe ironically or coincidentally. I'll find a link to that, and we can share that. But yeah, what do we want to do? I can maybe, we have a bunch of questions, so 10 open questions. I can try to rapid fire some of the topical ones if you want to do that.
sure, we can try.
Or do you have any? Then we can do some closing wrap up remarks after that. David Smith, as experts in the field, who do you turn to for technical help? We talked a lot about sort of getting advice from other people. Tim, who do you turn to for technical help?
That's a good question. I've got some good resources that aren't necessarily people that I turn to, and we've talked about some of those before. You know, books, including some of yours. You know, there's the online forums. You know, there's but not necessarily other developers that I turn to. I'm a solo developer, so it's a little bit challenging, I guess. My network is kind of small of people. I mean, I have a lot of people that I know in the NetSuite world, but I'm not close enough to them to like feel like I can reach out and bug them. So how about you?
Yeah. First, at work, I am fortunate to work around a bunch of talented, experienced NetSuite developers. So I sort of get that for free. I'm super fortunate there. But I also have a small community of while I might consider myself an expert, I'm not the expert. There are tons of experts in all kinds of different things within NetSuite. And so I have a private Slack channel with a handful of those people I trust and consider to be smarter than me. And I ask them questions. And then I try to at least pay attention in all the public places. NetSuite Professional Slack and that sort of thing, Stack Overflow, all that stuff. And just pay attention and learn from what other people are doing and how they're solving these problems. I might be an expert, but I don't know everything. I can always learn more. So that's that one. What tools, David Smith again? Oh, go ahead.
There's a good one that just popped up at the very bottom that has to do with SuiteScript 1 versus 2.
Go for it. Tackle it.
So the question was, what about technical debt related to SuiteScript 1 versus 2.1? I inherited a large number of 1.0 customizations, and we do not know how to start upgrading the existing customizations. I hate to laugh, but oh God, I don't envy you at all. I will tell you this, I refuse to work with SuiteScript 1.0. I know that there are still some things that we absolutely need it for, although if you ask me what they are right now, I couldn't tell you. That is a absolute red flag for me when I still see instances riddled with that. But worse is when I see active development in 1.0. Again, I know that there are some times where you can't avoid it, but I would say 99% of the time you can. All you're doing there is just taking the debt on. It's like going out to extravagant restaurants every night and maxing out your credit cards or yeah, just I don't know. You probably have a better way, a more eloquent way of maybe responding to that one, but yeah, it's a mess.
It is. That's going to be difficult because you're effectively writing a new language. You're writing a new project in a new language for all intents and purposes. You can get it pretty close if you sort of, there's a large amount of parity between the two. There is a help document that has like this NL API function corresponds to that 2.0 function and module. That's going to be helpful there. I would start with, I don't know where I would start. It's hard to say without the code base, but start small and come up with, and as you do that, start on the features that are maybe the least critical or impactful, or at least are smaller, just so you can sort of get your legs under you and start to establish some patterns and how you sort of communicate and test these changes and verify that they're working. You don't want to start on the red thread, the critical path for your business. You want to get your feet under you on smaller, less impactful stuff, and then move into the more critical stuff so that you can establish patterns and habits for how do we want to do this. Without seeing your actual code and spending a bunch of time assessing it, I can't tell you how to do it, but that is the general advice I would give for that.
Okay.
How much time do we have? We have 3 minutes. Oh no.
You had started to answer one of them, I think.
We're just going to scroll through really quick. Hubert, do you use a linter? Yes, I do. ESLint. Highly recommend it. Somebody asked about IDE. James asked about IDE. I use WebStorm. I don't have time to go into all of its advantages, but it runs all my unit tests. It has a terminal in it, so I can use my command line. It has SuiteScript code completion. And it looks pretty, or it used to. They just changed it and I hate it now. But okay, I think we should probably go into any closing remarks and wrap it up. You get to go first because I'm the host and I said
okay, so I kind of did earlier, my closing remarks were the technical debt. It's a real thing. Chances are you've seen it. Maybe you've done it yourself. Just try not to do it anymore. And then that comment I made about, if you care about the quality of your work, I think it's really just about getting better constantly, like trying to improve at what you're doing. I've joked in previous episodes that, I do not consider myself to be an expert SuiteScript developer by any means. The real irony in almost everything I do is that I almost despise JavaScript itself. That's another topic for another episode. I hear you, but I love programming, so there's the rub, right?
Hate JavaScript is add that to our episode list. Hate JavaScript.
So there you go.
I think I will. Yeah, I will just wrap up by reiterating. I think the best tool that you have is breaking down problems and introducing separations of concerns. So introduce modules and functions, break the problem, break the code down into smaller pieces. For the most part, use objects for your function parameters and not individual parameters, because it gets harder to rewrite that function. You can't change the order. You can't, there's a whole bunch you can't do if you start using separate parameters. That's something like really technical and nitty gritty that I wasn't really expecting to talk about, but breaking down your problems, your code, your systems into separate modules, separate functions, introduce that decoupling, and you'll have a much easier time mitigating and paying down your technical debt, because you'll be able to swap out those implementations a lot easier than if you have 25,000 lines in a client script.
So 2 quick things about that. One is that, I totally agree with you. Like when it comes to dealing with technical debt, that is a really good strategy. But I would also say that in general, and just development in general, like that's the way to be successful as a developer. Take big problem, break it down into smaller problems and solve them. There's that phrase, or, like I was saying, like, how do you eat an elephant? It's like, well, one bite at a time. And there you go, right? It's like, you don't do it all at once. You don't sit down and just write this massive, 1,000-line function. You break it down into logical little pieces and solve them one at a time. So, it's good advice that you gave there. So thank you.
I do my best. Anything else, Tim?
I think that's it.
All right. Well, then that brings this episode of SuiteScript Stories to a close. So thank you, everyone who is here live. The recording will be available on, I believe, YouTube soon. I'll have to confirm that with Salto, but and then we'll put it up in the SuiteScript Stories podcast feed in about a week. And we're still working on the old ones. I just got the audio files today. I'll get those cleaned up and we'll get those published to the feed in the next few days. That's up to Tim, though. I do the editing. He does the publishing. If you'd like to get in touch with us about the show or about NetSuite development, you can email me, eric@stoic.software, or check out Tim's website, timdietrich.me. And if you'd like to learn more about the Salto DevOps platform, just check out salto.io. And we hope you join us next time as we continue to sort of explore and highlight interesting stories and topics from the SuiteScript world. See you then.